Hello dear students, welcome to this class of MA Final American Literature Paper 5th B. Dear students, today we are going to discuss a beautiful poem by Emily Dickinson, the great American poet, and the title of the poem is I Felt a Funeral in My Brain. Emily Dickinson, dear students, as you all know, a major American poet of the 19th century, and she was born in a town Amherst in the United States. Her treatment to the theme of love and death, they are unique and they still remain unmatched in American literature. She has composed more than 500 poems on the same theme of love and death. She reveals her different attitudes to death, and she depicts death as a personified man who comes to attack our life, and sometimes uh, Dickinson depicts it as an agency which will reveal the secrets of our life through a proper enlightenment and so on. As you know, Emily did not marry. Only a couple of her poems were published in her life, and the rest of the poems were published posthumously. One of the greatest critics of Emily Dickinson, Thomas H. Johnson, he says that the complete poems, they were published with the help of her sister. So, dear students, the poem I Felt a Funeral in My Brain contains a detailed account of complete funeral as felt through the ebbing sensation of a dead man's son. According to the critic Thomas H. Johnson, the poem it deals with the direct knowledge of the absolute when the soul departs from the body and gains a temporary insight into the infinite. Emily Dickinson feels in her mind a funeral ceremony being celebrated. In this particular poem, in this scene, the poet realizes the grief-stricken multitude roaming about here and there. She feels them treading over the floor till the time her levels of perception sank down to unconsciousness. As you know, let us discuss the first stanza. I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro, that is, they were treading the floor, to and fro, kept treading, till it seemed that sense was breaking through. So, Dickinson, she says in the second stanza, and when they all were seated, a service like a drum kept beating, till I thought my mind was going numb. So, the poet, she faints and she observes the funeral, and in the setting which is there in the setting of the poem which the poem describes, it starts with the actual funeral ceremony. The atmosphere is oppressive, and the incessant treading of feet seems to torment the brain of the poet, the narrator, and the emphasis on dying sensation and failing powers suggests death's dreadful isolation of the body and the soul. How the soul is departing. On the other level, in the phrase in my brain, it hints that this physical death represents some terrible emotional pain or a great loss that brings an overwhelming sense of despair. The grief stricken, that is, the nearest and dearest one, the moving crowd took their seats, and the funeral ceremony, such as beating of the drum, continued. And by the time the poetess' mind grew benumbed, she was almost unable to feel anything. The poet Dickinson once more stresses the senselessness when she felt the entire scene faded in her vision. The formality of the funeral ceremony penetrates the soul like beating of the drum, and it induces a dragged weariness. The poetess heard the sound of those who lifted the coffin up in the air. At this very moment, the soul produced unpleasant and painful noise, as she depicts in the third stanza of the poem. And when I am reading from the text, and when they all were seated, a service like a drum kept beating till I thought my mind was going numb. And now look at the third stanza. And then I heard them lift a box, that is the coffin, and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll. So she presents to us the lifting of the coffin. At this very moment, the soul produced unpleasant and painful noise. This noise of the soul was mingled with the noise produced by the lead metal contained in the boots of those who carried the coffin. The noise of the soul, it was mingled, as I told you, and the space behind the coffin rang up with a sad noise produced by the tolling bell to indicate the death. This is very uh, artistically presented by Emily Dickinson. Heavens produced jingling, welcoming sounds which were not heard by anyone, and at such an occasion, the soul realized itself from the dead body and found a place somewhere in the infinite space. The soul was eternized in between the heavenly sounds unheard by the earthly spirits. I quote, as in the fourth stanza, the poet writes, Emily Dickinson, as all the heavens were a bell, and being but an ear, and eye, and silence, some strange race wrecked solitary here. And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down, and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. So the poem, it comes to an end with this. The writer, the poet, says this coffin, when it was being placed, it was to be placed in the grave, one of the reasonable plank forming the coffin broke and fell down, covering several divisions of height. This reason, this reasonable plank allowed the soul to escape. The soul tried to find a suitable place in the entire universe, so it struck the world at so many places that it could adjust itself somewhere in the space. Initially, the soul could not find an appropriate place, so it had to strike at more and more places. No one can tell the spot of its existence in the entire space. Meantime, in the meantime, the poet recovered her senses and perceptions. The keynote or the main idea of the poem, we can say, the soul selects her own society. is the exclusiveness of friendship and the highly selective quality of developing for our closest affection. All our affections, all our nearest and dearest ones, they are left mourning. It is possible that in this poem, it is an assumption that in the poem, the poet shows her own choice of solitary life, as she prefers her own small circle closing the doors or the general world, as the opening lines of the poem suggest. And as you know, Emily Dickinson, she always enjoyed this solitary company. Having scrutinized the entire world, the human soul, it selects her social company. After the selection of the social company, soul disconnects all relation with the mundane life. The soul, with her company, remains completely isolated from the entire universe to achieve spiritual and emotional sublimity. The stanza portrays exclusiveness of friendship and very high selective attitude in love pursuits. And this stanza, it reveals Dickinson's choice of solitary life, and the poet, it suggests, the poet Emily Dickinson suggests that the poetess not all going through change of society, even if kingly request persuades her, if the majestic class desires to participate in her social circle, she is sure to turn down the request. The poetess will be so strong-headed and impetuous in her decision that a royal emperor kneeling before her to find a seat in her company is not likely to be paid attention to. So, in this poem, we can say that Dickinson imagines her own funeral in the poem, and she felt the funeral in her brain. It is one of the most important and popular poems which she composed about the theme of death. In this poem, she accounts her own dying perception and also the grief which mourners exhibit when she is no more. Mainly, she concentrates on the silent visitors, silent visit of the soul from this ghastly world to the next world of eternity. The poem is full of so many literary devices, for example, personification, alliteration, and assonance. We can trace personification, alliteration, and assonance. The poem, for example, has and, dropped down and down, and I and silence some strange rays. It is a successful death poem, we can say. And Emily Dickinson, as you know, she celebrates the funeral, how she felt a funeral in her brain. Dear students, I hope you have understood the poem. We'll discuss another poem of Emily Dickinson in the next video. Thank you very much.